Russ Muirhead, welcome to the podcast.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Well, I really look forward to this conversation. Russ, I've known you for many years, but I've only known you for a few years in your new capacity as an elected official. What's it been like going from studying politics and teaching politics to making politics, to being a state legislator in New Hampshire?
I have to say, it's a lot of fun. Doing politics is a lot of fun. Sitting in a legislature is, for me, it's like, I don't know, being back in school. I just feel like I learn so much every day, and I almost think any political scientist would probably love serving in a legislature for a couple of years if they could possibly manage it. And it's easier
in general. Political scientists should spend a lot more time talking to normal people, listening to focus groups, and if they could even actually go and do some politics, they might understand more about the world.
Yeah, and I'd say a legislature in particular, because there's a difference between kind of activism politics, movement politics, and legislative politics. And movement politics, it's often about activating like-minded people, identifying yourself to other like-minded people, discovering each other, coming together, forming a movement. That has an essential place in democratic reform. But legislative politics, I mean, it's about brokering disagreement from the beginning. There's no legislature that's defined just by a movement. There's always more than one party, more than one faction in a legislature. So legislative politics are about making politics with under conditions of disagreement. And that's a different experience from just getting involved in the neighborhood, state, whatever, national level in a movement.
Oh, that's interesting. I was thinking about a different difference, which is that it's very easy standing on the outside as an academic or sometimes as an opinion writer and saying, why is the government being stupid in pursuing policy A when it has bad effect X? But when you're a legislator or when you're a policymaker, you feel like, well, I have policy A that has, bad effect X, but also good effect Y. Or I have policy B, which is, bad effect K and good effect L. And those are my two options, right? So which, all things considered, is better? And so it's often really unhelpful to stand on the sidelines saying, you idiots, you caused X. When from the inside, you're saying, yes, I know, and I'm upset about that. But the alternative would have caused this other bad outcome, which all things considered, I believe, is even worse. So you have to sort of tell me a little bit more to be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, look, there's a kind of right answer mentality in politics. Like the right answers are there. It's just about authorizing them, empowering them. And actually, a lot of people in the legislature have that mentality. I mean, they kind of think, look, if our side just didn't encounter any obstacles, we would be able to legislate the right answers, and the world would be permanently improved as a result of that. And the phrase that my co-author Nancy Rosenblum used in the title of one of her books is "on the side of the angels." It's incredibly tempting to think that's your side, and I don't think people who are engaged in practical legislative politics are immune to that. But there's a kind of what you're describing is a certain kind of wisdom. It might come from political activity. It might come just from looking at the details of policy, which is, the realization that there are no right answers, or very rarely do we face something where there's just a right answer, a great answer, or an answer that solves our problems. And there's always, we're always in politics in a world of second best at best.
You just made me realize something that I actually hadn't thought about, a parallel between two different institutions in our democracies. So one quintessential democratic institution is an adversarial legal system in which somebody makes the case for the prosecution and somebody makes the case for the defense. Now, by and large, there may be exceptions. People who are part of that system understand that they're going to, really strongly play the role of one of these, but you need both roles, right? A prosecutor should understand that the system to function as it should needs a good defense. And even a public defender should understand that you need somebody to prosecute criminals, and that a good prosecutor that plays fairly is important for the system to come to the right results. Now, in a way, a parliament was conceived of as a similar thing, right? That you don't try to suppress factions, you try to organize and verbalize them in the hope that the debate between them and the clash between them is going to come up to policy that's closer to the public good than the alternative would be. But interestingly, the participants in that system rarely have that kind of self-conception, right? I think most lawyers do understand, hey, I'm arguing my case, but I'm glad there's somebody out there arguing the other case well. In our political system, perhaps because of polarization, perhaps because of the anti-democratic shift of the Republican Party, perhaps because of some other reasons, that doesn't really seem to be the case most of the time, that self-understanding.
Yeah, I think you're putting your finger on something really, really cool, really, really important, actually, really important to making politics work in the United States, and also paradoxically important to building a governing majority, a party that can really rule. And that is, yeah, I like the analogy to the adversarial system in criminal law. You're absolutely right. Like the very best lawyers always understand the other side. They understand the other's case. They understand the weakness. They could try the case on the other side like that and do a great job because they know the weaknesses of their own side. They know the bad facts that they have to cover up or answer for. And they also understand the utility of having an argument, and they respect the other side. It's a very bad lawyer who doesn't know how to make the case on the other side. Well, in politics, we have a lot of equivalent like bad lawyers. We have a lot of people, a lot of Democrats who look across and think, why are they Republicans? Just because people are evil, because people are frail and self-interested in the money to rule, the money to skew everything. And you got a bunch of privileged people who are trying to defend their privilege. So there's no good reason for the other side. And the Republicans look at the Democrats and see a bunch of, self-serving cultural elites like professors like me, and people who don't want to work, people who are takers, not makers, to go back to kind of Romney's characterization. And they think, well, the world would just be much better off if we didn't have that side. And if that's the way we're thinking of each other, first of all, we've just taken a very, very giant step toward delegitimizing the other side, which is one of the huge problems today, and toward the way conspiracy works in American politics and elsewhere. But also, we've made it more difficult for us to understand our own weaknesses, to answer for them, to guard against them, and to build a real coalition. So yeah, like a huge part, probably the single most important thing that a civic education could do is enable citizens to give an account of each side or the many sides to the political contest, and one that shows us what a conservative would look like at their best, and so good that you think, wow, I would hope that any good democracy would have some conservatives, and would show what a progressive looks like at their best, so that you'd hope that there'd be some really good progressives in any polity. And I don't mean to compress politics to just two sides, but let's just work with that, since in the United States we have these two great parties, one of which identifies itself as progressive and one of which identifies itself as conservative. If you're a progressive and you can't give an account of what conservatism really looks like and what a conservative party ought to be, then you're driving with your eyes closed, and you're going to make it harder to paradoxically build your party, because you can't take those little bits of wisdom from the conservative side and try to acquire them. Similarly for the other side. And Yascha, well, sorry, but that's, I think you're right. You're really onto something that's incredibly incisive.
So there's sort of two ideas in this, right? The first is the existence of what I've heard called the ideological Turing test, right? So the Turing test is the ability of a computer to pass as a human. The ideological Turing test is the ability of a progressive to write a talking point about abortion or about some kind of topic so that a conservative would see it and say, yes, that sounds like the argument I would make. That sounds like the argument somebody on my side would make. And obviously vice versa as well, the ability of a conservative to formulate an argument about abortion, about some other big topic in such a way that progressives would say, yes, this feels like a fair account of what my side believes. This feels like it was written by somebody on my side. And I guess the first point is being able to do that reduces effective polarization to some extent, because it means that rather than thinking, well, this is such a crazy position that only a lunatic would hold that, or only an evil person would hold that, you start to say, hey, I'm able to put myself in their shoes and therefore to understand that reasonable people may be persuaded by this argument. I may not agree with this argument at all, I may very strongly disagree with it, but I can see how a decent person could hold it, right? I mean, I guess the second point that you're insinuating is that being able to pass the ideological Turing test actually helps you win elections. Now, why is that? Is that because it means that you can sort of craft policy that is more acceptable to the other side? Is it because you can play to some of them sort of moral concerns? Is it because you can find effective responses to what they're really animated by? Why do you think that if Democrats were better at passing the ideological Turing test, they may be better able to beat Donald Trump in 2024?
And by the way, I think the point about diminishing the toxicity of affective polarization, that would be enough. If that's all this did, that would be enough to advocate for the civic capacity of describing the world as the other side sees it. But yeah, I think in fact it would help you win elections. It'd help Democrats win elections if they could understand and give a good account, a better account of conservatism than most conservatives could offer. That would really help. Why? Look, we operate under a framework of constitutional rules. Now you and I, as kind of political and legal thinkers, might have a better constitution in mind for a country like the United States than the one that the United States actually possesses and inherited, from the summer of 1787. So let's just put aside our ideals for a moment and say we've got this constitution. It has a Senate. In the Senate, the states are represented, and somehow we didn't get just one Dakota, we got 2 Dakotas. So somehow, progressives are geographically very clustered. And so for the Progressive Party to build a majority, they need to create a geographically dispersed majority. They need to appeal to people outside of Boston and San Francisco. And that means that, they need to appeal to people who aren't as pure as progressives and as liberals as maybe the definitive progressive is. And they can't do that if they don't understand something. They need, the Democratic Party needs Joe Manchin to have a majority in the Senate. And as Joe Manchin said, if you don't like the way I vote, elect more progressives. He says, I'm not a progressive, but you're not going to get a progressive senator out of West Virginia. And if you don't have a Democratic senator out of West Virginia right now, you don't have a majority in the Senate. So we don't need, less Joe Manchins. We need 4 more of them, actually, or 8 more of them. So you have a filibuster-proof majority. Anyway, so that's just one reason. In the United States, to rule, you need to, there's this numeric formula. I'm just going to describe it, even though I don't mean to be condescending like a teacher is so often. But you need a majority of 435 congressional districts. That are elected every 2 years. You need a majority of the states, but only 1/3 of them is elected every 2 years. And so you need a majority that's populous, that's numerous, to get the Congress. You need a majority that's enduring in time to get the Senate, because you need to hold your majority together for at least 4 years to get a majority there. And you need a majority that's geographically dispersed. You need a durable, extensive, and diverse majority to rule under this Constitution. It's not obviously a time slice majority of just the national population. And there's no way to do that without creating a really, really cacophonous, heterogeneous, diverse, or as we like to say, inclusive majority. And purity rituals are not going to get us there. And just the deepening conviction that the way you think is the perfect way to think, and that your party isn't a party, it's the side of the angels, doesn't get you there. And what does get you there is a really capacious political imagination where you can close your eyes and imagine how the world looks to somebody who sees it from the other side of the political fray. And then you can start to, like I said, not just manipulate people who disagree with you, but actually capture some of the pieces of wisdom and insight that the other side kind of has an advantage in possessing, and bring them over to your side. Mix them in with your public philosophy. Mix a few conservative elements in with a dominantly progressive public philosophy to get something that can elect, 54 senators.
Yeah, this strikes me as one of the really odd pieces of sort of progressive discourse in the last few years, when there's all of this focus on how unjust the Constitution supposedly is, how unjust the Senate supposedly is. And there are certain remedies to it which I favor. I think that Puerto Ricans should be given a vote on whether they want to join the United States as a state, and of course they may decide not to. I think there is a good argument for the District of Columbia to have full voting rights, including representation in the Senate. But the fundamental factors that drive this are just not realistically going to change. And I feel like sort of the attempt to delegitimize the basic shape of the Senate often comes at the expense of recognizing that realistically Democrats, in order to have influence in this country, will just have to win 51, or as you're saying, potentially 60 Senate seats. So what do you think it would look like for the Democratic Party to actually realize that? What does it take for Democrats to be able to win in Indiana, in Missouri, perhaps in one of the Dakotas? And to anticipate one of the frequent objections to this, am I just saying that we should give up on the rights of minorities and that we should sort of throw our cards in and give up on anything that's important to progressives? Or is there a way of building those majorities in a way that is conformable with, I would say, liberal rather than progressive, but let's say left of center values about equality and the equal treatment of all of our citizens?
Yeah, and I mean, the first thing I think we have to do is make this our goal. I think that the real defect I see in American politics right now is a lack of ambition. Both sides want to win the next election and only the next election, and they're content to win it just barely. I see this absence of ambition as even more definitive on the Republican side than the Democrat. It's always easier to see the flaws of your opponents, but trying to kind of disenfranchise people on the margin so that you get that 0.4% of the vote or 0.4% advantage, and just barely win the congressional seat in a swing district. I mean, that wasn't the way Ronald Reagan thought about American politics. He took his conservatism to the country. He argued for it. I found it unconvincing and in many ways repellent, but he won 49 states after serving for one term. And that's, that was a reflection of not just his, capacity as a speaker, but his ambition. And the last Republican I saw that had that ambition was Karl Rove, when he was elected with George Bush. When he helped get George W. Bush elected in 2000, he came in and said, we're going to try to build a durable governing majority. That's a quote from an interview he gave to the New Yorker that sent chills up the spines of liberals all over the country when they read it. And he wanted to make conservatism compassionate. So he took this thing from the progressive side, compassion, and tried to acquire it for conservatism. What liberals and conservatives need to do is exactly that, but in reverse. We need to identify the things in the conservative public philosophy that actually are good, and try to get some of those for us. Now, here too, virtue. Democrats tend to speak the language of equality, and less so the language of virtue or distinctiveness or deservingness. And there's no reason why we should have a one-sided, egalitarian language that gives up on virtue completely. We appreciate distinction. We appreciate effort. And we understand that some people make a claim for themselves that shows them to be, in a sense, unequal. We also understand that everybody can make a certain kind of claim for themselves by by revealing their virtue to the world, and that one of the ways to do that is through work and the dignity of work. And I think Democrats have to speak the language of the dignity of work. It's consistent with their belief in making work pay. It's consistent with their commitment to protecting the rights of workers. But they also have to believe in hard work, and not just in the right not to work, but in hard work and in what and the virtues that human beings show to the world when they work hard at something, when they master something, and when they care about doing something well. So, I mean, that's just one example. If conservatism can be compassionate, and I think it can be, I don't think it's really tried very hard to be since the early 2000s. The more progressive and egalitarian public philosophy can also be about virtue. And I really think work is the thing for us to keep our eyes on. And we have to remember that the work ethic is something that matters, and that not should be defended. Another thing is a certain kind of love of country. So it's obvious to me as a Democrat and as somebody in electoral politics just how profoundly patriotic my friends are in the Democratic Party. Um, but we're really good at also criticizing our country. And to be a progressive is to say, hey, here are the things we're inheriting in our political, community and our tradition that are unjust, that are unwise. We want to change them. We want to change and improve and progress. So that's our whole orientation. But that doesn't mean that that we're not kind of awed by what we've inherited, and that we don't love what we have and want to preserve a lot of it. And I think we need to learn how to speak that language without giving up one speck of our conviction about individual rights and the way those apply to even the smallest minority, to even the most overlooked individuals. And so, no, we don't change that, but we do look to what we can acquire to complement our public philosophy.
I couldn't agree more. You speak beautifully about, sticking with your liberal and progressive values, but also finding the areas where you can have agreement and overlap with conservatives. What does that look like in the legislature? You've now been in the New Hampshire state legislature for about 2 years. When you come into that very adversarial environment, does everybody sort of revert to being on the side of the angels and shouting at each other across the aisle, or have you had opportunities to put some of those aspirations into practice?
I'll tell you, it's hard to overstate how adversarial it is, and how adversarial my experience in the New Hampshire legislature was in the last 2 years. I mean, I was in the minority, and when you're in the minority, you lose almost everything. And the stuff that we lost was stuff that I care about as much as I care about anything in public life. Is stuff that has to do with reproductive rights, with voting rights, with public education. And so when a bill that I really care about goes down, and I see the other side celebrating its defeat, or something I really oppose passes, I mean, it's hard to describe the feeling one has. It's a feeling, there are feelings of revulsion, of hatred, of despondency. It's hard. It's really hard. It's hard to lose in politics. And it's hard to look over and say, oh yeah, well, I understand what it means to be a conservative. I'm a political philosopher. I can give an account. No, that's not the feeling I have when I lose one of these bills. And it's not the feeling I have when the other side pulls some, procedural shenanigan in order to advance its cause, something that's perfectly within the bounds of the rules, but is a little bit unusual or something, and maybe undercuts the spirit of free, fair play, or so we think on the losing side. So no, it's really hard. It's really hard. It's really easy to hate the other side. It's really easy to come to think of them as just, as constituted by people who are just fundamentally not nice, or fundamentally corrupt, or something like that. Super easy. And I actually think that the most important thing in day-to-day work in politics, where you're in the fray, is to be able to participate in common life. I think a little bit about here, if you don't mind me, David Hume, this prodigy philosopher out of the Scottish Enlightenment, is talking about his philosophic theories that actually fill him with doubt and despair, theories of skepticism. And he says, what cures it for him is going out to the pub and having a drink with friends and playing backgammon. And he says this in the Treatise on Human Understanding. And well, you don't have to read David Hume to know this. I mean, to have a drink with somebody, to have a cup of coffee with somebody, to have lunch with somebody. One time I was in this committee meeting in an academic context, and we fought for 3 days. It was a committee that met for 3 days. We fought. And at the end of the 3 days, I thought, I never want to see these people I've been disagreeing with again for the rest of I'd never want to see them. I'm not coming to campus again for months, I thought. And the guy I disagree with the most put his hand on my shoulder and said, we're going out to lunch. I almost wanted to puke. And but I said, okay. And we went out to buy, and like 2 beers into that lunch, we were singing songs, enjoying each other. Like we were having a good time. And we didn't stop disagreeing, but we remembered what it would be like to just interact as two human beings. And so I do think, say concretely for somebody in a legislature, I try to do this, have lunch, have coffee, make fun of each other. It's incredibly, sort of healthy to let people make fun of you. Tell a joke at your expense, tell a joke at somebody else, take the piss out of somebody, as they say in the UK. And when the vote comes, you're still going to really hate the other side, and it's still going to sting and hurt, and you're going to, when the campaign comes, you're going to campaign against the other side with everything you have. But in between, learn how to, remember how to be human with each other. And just, quickly, this past summer or spring or whatever, I don't know, say June, I got an email. It was like, legislative softball game. We're meeting, to play softball, come. And I thought, that's the last thing I want to do with these people who have been sticking it to me over and over and over again for the last 2 years, and I could give you an account of the Republicans I've gone up against that would probably make you hate them. I can describe what they did and what they. So that's how I felt. I don't want to go play softball. And my wife said, "Oh, come on, you got to go. Like, you got to go be human." I was like, all right, it's a hot day. It's Sunday. I'd rather be with my kids. I drive down. It's probably 2 hours away. And sure enough, there's a cooler full of beer and we're hanging out. And, we didn't play like Republican against Democrat. It's kind of mixed up. And, we just had such a nice time. And an hour and a half into it, I was like, why are these people here? It's not because they're liberals or conservatives. They just want to advance their sides, because they want to make this institution work, the legislature. They're investing, they're breathing life in the institution itself. They're trying to maintain some ties of likability, some capacity to enjoy each other as human beings, so that when we go back in there and fight like mad, we don't destroy the place.
What does that look like in your day-to-day work in legislature? I believe you're on the election law committee, or I don't know exactly what the name of the committee is. What is the nature of the disagreements over this really consequential issue at the moment? And have you been able to find some kind of common ground on an issue that in New Hampshire, but also in many other states, particularly in Pennsylvania and Arizona, may cut to the core of whether we have free and fair elections in the United States in 2024?
Yeah, you're right on. I mean, and that is the committee I serve on. It's the election law committee, and that's actually why I ran 2 years ago. Nancy Rosenblum and I had just finished this book called "A Lot of People Are Saying" about what we called the new conspiracism in American politics, and among other things, we wrote about the rigged election conspiracy, and we kind of followed the logic of that conspiracy to the possibility. We write about it in the conclusion of the book, that a president might lose an election, and fail to vacate the office. And by the way, when we were writing that out, we pulled it from the text at one point. We said, this is just too outlandish. People are going to think we've kind of lost our bearings if we have this in the book. And then we thought, but no. If you actually do follow the logic along, that is where it kind of leads. So we got to put it in there, and not because we think it will happen. Well, of course, January 6th did happen. Anyway, so I thought there might be this kind of attack on election administration. What seemed preposterous in 2016 for the person who won the election to claim that the election was rigged, and actually claimed that the elections in New Hampshire were rigged, that busloads of people were sent up from Massachusetts to fraudulently vote in the little towns of New Hampshire, and in the wards of our cities. And by the way, if you know anything about like New Hampshire voting, it wouldn't be easy to unload buses of people from Massachusetts, but that was the allegation. It was actually investigated by the New Hampshire Secretary of State's office, of course, which found that there was no fraud whatsoever in the 2016 election. Again, it's so weird for the winner of the election to say this. He was upset he lost the popular vote, I guess. But that's why I went in. I wanted to get on the election law committee. Luckily, the leadership put me on that committee. And yes, that's ground zero for the attack on election administration. It's happening in the states, not at the national level, and it's happening in states all over the country. And there are just millions of people, possibly tens of millions of people, who think that American elections are marred by widespread fraud and think that, recent elections were rigged. And they're getting people to, in the Republican Party, to introduce bills that will actually paradoxically create opportunities for fraud. And so, yeah, that's what, that's what I'm really focused on. Quick example, there was a bill that came up, and this is a bill that you see in states all over the country, to eradicate the machine counting of ballots. And, it's a certain kind of common sense to that. How can we know what these machines are doing? How do we know that the electronics haven't been mucked with, so forth? And, and in the UK, for instance, they don't use machine counts. They hand count ballots. But what happens, the difference between the very unique thing about American elections is that we elect people to all kinds of stuff. Our ballots are really long, and every state has its, panoply of offices and constitutional questions, and sometimes referenda. So they're hardly, in an off-term election in New Hampshire, there's 20 things to vote for. You're voting for sheriffs and county commissioners and county attorneys and on and on. It's not just the president. It's not just your member of parliament. So to hand count every one of these offices, because people, are going to go back and forth in terms of the parties they vote for, it would take weeks and weeks and weeks. And during those weeks, there'd be all sorts of opportunity for highly interested parties to introduce distortions. Meanwhile, we know from recounts that optical scanners are actually more reliable than hand counts, and that the error rates are minuscule. So this is just an interesting example where, look, this kind of thing has to be defeated if you want to maintain elections with integrity. There's also an effort to basically impose, to create partisans and insert partisans into the administration of elections all over the country. So we're also kind of fighting for the ideal of nonpartisan election administration. And yeah, that, what opportunities are there for coming together? That was your question. Sorry, I didn't really get to it, because really the number one opportunity here is the opportunity to fight against the MAGA fueled attack on election administration.
You had a story about how on the committee there was a real disagreement.
I can get that.
Do you not want to get into that publicly, or is that?
No, I'm happy to. Yeah, so against the background of this fight, and it's a partisan fight in many of these bills. Look, here's the thing. Let's say the dynamic is the Democrats in the minority, the Republicans in the majority. So to win this fight, I've got to get some Republicans to join the coalition. That's the only way I'm going to defeat some stuff like this. Got to make some sort of common cause. And one of the ways you do that is by looking for those bills that just aren't fundamentally ideological or partisan. And in any legislature, just sort of like the Supreme Court, there are a whole bunch of cases that, are going to be essentially partisan ideological cases, but a whole bunch are not. And you look for those occasions where you can get a 9-0, in the case of my committee, 21-0 vote. And you try not to make those partisan also. So quick anecdote, there was a bill that came up. It was essentially an in-the-weeds bill on election administration. There was nothing ideological or partisan about it. But I could see the way it was shaken out. It was going to be a party vote. And this can happen on anything. Once you start to really dislike each other, once you start to not trust each other, once you're just used to fighting with each other, if they go this way, we go that way. And if they go high, we go low. If they go low, we go high. So it was going to be a 11-9 vote. And I was like, there's no reason for this to happen. And I said, I think to the chair, I think if we work on this a little bit more, we could probably get a unanimous vote out of it. And the chair, who was a Republican, saw the utility of that. And she did, because she could have just said, stop wasting my time. We're gonna just, we have the vote. I can do anything I want on this committee. I'm the majority. I'm the head of the majority. Instead of doing that, she said, no, okay, let's see if you're so smart, professor. Let's see what you can do. And we created a little working group. And the people who really cared about the bill, they came in with the most kind of moving spirit of compromise. They really wanted to solve problems, in the weeds problems that election moderators experience. And they said, okay, I can give up on this. One of them said, but this thing I think is really important. The other one's like, okay, if you think that's really important, I think I can go along with you on that. But such and such is where I draw the line. And they did this, and in 45 minutes, they revised this bill so that the leaders of the two factions could sign on to it. And it passed unanimously. And that, I saw that possibility. I'm glad I spoke up, but I'm also even more glad that the committee chair from the other party saw that this would be worth trying. And I do think we need to do as much of that as we possibly can, so that we have the social capital that will allow us to maintain a democracy through the fights that we know we're going to have. And also so that if I'm in the minority again, that I can get a few people from the others. I have enough trust and goodwill on the other side that occasionally I can say, hey, this is one we got to figure out a way around this. And they'll at least listen.
You mentioned your great book with Nancy. Some people are saying, why are conspiracy theories so central to American politics, the politics of other democracies at the moment, politics in particular of these populist candidates and movements? And what do people normally get wrong about conspiracies? How is it that our usual way of conceptualizing what the nature of a conspiracy theory is actually misunderstands them?
The sort of a classic account of conspiracy theories is that they are sort of the tool that losing social classes and social groups use to make sense of their declining position. And there's a chapter of a recent, maybe 10-year ago book on American conspiracy theories that says conspiracy theories are for losers. And it's a very familiar idea. It goes back to Hofstadter. That's not what we're seeing right now. When Putin engages in the billion-person conspiracy theory, when the president of the United States trucks in one conspiracy after another. They're the most powerful people in the world. And it's no longer just about, social groups kind of explaining to themselves a hostile world by scapegoating some minority. It's really different, and it's more political. It's about power. It's really common when people hear like what they think of as baffling and wacky conspiracies, like say Pizzagate, Hillary Clinton, child sex trafficking from the basement of a pizza. It's just preposterous. It's ludicrous. Like who would? And you think, well, the question they ask is who could believe this? Do the people who repeat it actually believe it? And those are psychological questions, and we ask them because we just can't imagine that people could bring themselves to believe something so wacky. But the psychological questions, as interesting as they are, I think are distracting us from the politics of these. And what these do in practice is delegitimate the other side. They eliminate all doubt. We were just talking about this kind of at the beginning of our conversation, this idea that your side, as convincing as it is, isn't the side of the angels, isn't the whole truth, isn't perfection, and how that leads to kind of ideally picking insightful elements of the opposite public philosophy and acquiring. Well, what conspiracy theory does is says, don't worry about the other side. They're not just erroneous. They're not just mistaken. They are evil. They are, in this case, as evil or more evil than Nazis. They literally are, abusing children. And if you were in an election against a Nazi, and you lost, would you concede peacefully? Say, okay, here you go, Nazi, take over. Here are the keys to the office. So this it's not the particular propositions. Is there child sex trafficking going on in the basement of this pizzeria? Though some will believe all of that, like the person who showed up in the pizzeria with an assault rifle and fired it in an effort to free the so-called children. But it's more the attitude that it inculcates. The other side isn't just different or mistaken, it's evil, and therefore shouldn't be tolerated. And that's what's motivating conspiracism today in American politics. And it's delegitimating the political opposition. And that's incredibly corrosive to electoral democracy. So I would sort of say, let's not ask why people believe it. Interesting psychological question. If we get stuck there, we'll never get to the politics of it, which is, why are people repeating it? Well, because power seekers find it very, very useful to delegitimate the opposition. It helps them get power and keep power. And who knows if Donald Trump believes that the election was rigged? I don't care. I don't know if it's an answerable question as a matter of his psyche, but I still know why he's uttering it, because everyone who loses an election has a strong incentive to say the election was rigged. And when we get to a political life where everyone who does lose an election says that and convinces their followers to believe it, we won't have a functioning democracy.
So this helps me understand. So this helps me formulate why one usual way of talking about conspiracy theories is sort of wrong-headed. So a lot of the time, when people write about misinformation, quote unquote, they say, oh, there's these reasonable people with reasonable beliefs, and when they come across these conspiracy theories or these forms of misinformation, and then because of that, they go and vote for these terrible people, or they go and take on these, bad beliefs. But that always seemed implausible to me, right? If you have a basic set of compassion for the other side of the political aisle, if you don't have very extreme political views, you're never going to be convinced that Hillary Clinton is running a sex traffic ring out of a pizza parlor in the suburbs in Washington, D.C., right? It seems to me that it works a little bit the other way around. The reason why people are willing to believe some of these conspiracy theories, whether they truly do so, whether that's just sort of an article of, a demonstrative article of faith in order to show how you feel, is to say, those people are so evil, there's nothing I would put past them, right? Those people are so evil, they may as well be, child molesters, and perhaps they really are, right? But what does that tell us about how to deal with conspiracy theories? Because I think the reason why that earlier belief is so popular is that it gives a false but relatively simple set of instructions about how to respond to conspiracy theories, which goes vaguely, well, people end up believing this stuff because they have exposure to it. So if only we censor Twitter and Facebook, or we change the algorithms, or we give people better education, or whatever the intervention is supposed to be, then they'll recognize that this is lies, and they will be more compassionate towards the other side, and things will be great. And that's not what's going on here, right? The thing that drives these conspiracy theories is pre-existing polarization, is a pre-existing commitment to hating the other side. What can we do to control the corrosive and dangerous effects that conspiracy theories have on society, as is the case with the one guy who clearly did truly believe his conspiracy theories and set out for the pizza parlor to, quote unquote, liberate children that didn't exist, and to control the effect on our political system, on the ability of people like Donald Trump to say, ignore the outcome of the election, all of that was rigged, I should stay in power.
And it's the right question. It's the hardest question to answer, and it's in a sense the only question to ask. What can we do about it? Truth and shame. I think those are the two forces we have to marshal. The power of truth still does matter. It matters enormously to simply publicize the fact that Barack Obama was born in the United States and was, constitutionally eligible to serve in the office of the presidency. It's absolutely essential to get those facts out there in every way you possibly can. Not because true believers will change their minds when they see the long form birth certificate. The true believer will never change her mind or his mind. But there are a lot of people out there who don't know what to think. And what conspiracism does is it disorients them. And I'm not quite sure. I don't know about this guy, Obama. Where is he really from? And they're not saying he wasn't born in the United States, but the conspiracy theory has them wondering about where he's from and about what he's about. So that's the group we're fighting for, is a group that could be disoriented. And I'll tell you, who isn't disoriented in today's information ecosystem from time to time? So it can be extremely, extremely rooting and stabilizing to hear someone cite real evidence, publicly available evidence. So as elemental as that function, fact checking really does, it's absolutely essential. The second thing, though, that I think we have to make more use of is shame. We have to create ways of shaming those who truck in conspiracism. So there's a candidate here in New Hampshire who's running for Senate. It's a Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate seat, Bolduc, B-O-L-D-O-C, who's running against the incumbent senator, Democrat Maggie Hassan. And throughout the Republican primary campaign, this candidate insisted that the 2020 election was stolen and said things like, I'm never going to stop believing that. I'm never going to stop saying that. I'm never going to get off this horse, I think was the phrase that this person used in a Republican primary debate over the summer. Within 5 days of winning the primary, this person said, oh, the election wasn't stolen. Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States. And reporters said, why,
I don't know whether to respond to that with relief or revulsion. I don't know whether
exactly.
It's worse that somebody is a true believer in a dangerous and crazy idea, or whether it's worse that they pretend to be a true believer in it, but are actually, in political science terms, perfectly rational, just doing, saying whatever they need to in order to win the primary, and then, pivoting, as the horrible phrase is in America in the general, to have a shot in that election.
Yeah. Look, we have to marshal through social media and traditional media the force of public shame. This person should just be shamed nonstop. And yes, you're right. Like, he moved his position toward the right, but still should be shamed for having been willing so cynically to truck in that conspiracy theory all summer while trying to, recruit votes at the extreme wing of the Republican Party, people who might vote in the primary. And listen, this gets back to the question. The question is not, do people believe it? The question is, do they repeat it? And there are incentives for repeating conspiracy theories, even when you don't totally believe them. And people, the epistemic kind of standards that people bring to the question, can I repeat it? Can I retweet it? Can I forward it? Can I like it? Are much, much lower than the standards that they bring to, do I profess it? And so we have a media ecosystem now where stuff can get spread, it can get repeated by people who won't stand up and say, I believe it. And so this kind of, validation through repetition is what's empowering conspiracism in our public life. But I think shaming and mockery, along with kind of like the truth function is essential. There's something a little bit kind of goody about it, the fact checker. But so I think, it's important, but I think mockery, we're not using mockery nearly as much as we should. And mockery is an extraordinarily effective tool in politics.
Yeah, I think the important thing is to deploy mockery when somebody is doing something that really is morally unacceptable and widely unpopular, right? I think we have a lot of mockery that is smug and self-serving because somebody dares to run astray of a relatively narrow consensus. One example of this, to me, was when Eric Adams was arguing, whatever you believe about the substance of that, for opening New York City back up in the spring of this year. And he was basically saying, look, it's one thing for people who have white-collar jobs who sit at home on Zoom to have to look after their kids very, very hard as well. But, a lot of, and he used the phrase, low-educated workers in New York, were the majority, who have to go out and be there physically when their kids can't go to school, they can't go to their job, and they lose their wages. And so he was actually standing up for working-class New Yorkers, whether or not you agree with his ultimate policy preference. And there was a firestorm on Twitter saying, how dare you say low-educated? Now, perhaps that's not the best term. Perhaps he should in future use some kind of other different term. But when people perceive that somebody's standing up for them, I mean, this person gets marked because he applied some term for you that you may not even mind that much, or you might prefer a different term, but you probably care more that somebody's standing up for what's in your interest. That, I think, is a sort of mockery that can often get politicians and Democrats in particular in trouble.
Yeah, and maybe that's look, these are potent tools, shame and mockery. So you can misuse them, and we probably do more than we use them. Right. Here's another one though. Besides truth and shame, the other side of the human spectrum, nobility. there's that great moment. If you Google, I think just John McCain moment, you probably get it. When John McCain in a town hall encountered a voter who referred to, Barack Obama, someone who wasn't a citizen, wasn't an American, and he interrupts the person, said, "No, ma'am, no, no, ma'am. He is a citizen. He's a good person. He's a family man," McCain says. "He and I just disagree about policies and principles, and that's what this campaign is about." And I'm not sure. I think he might have even been booed a bit, lightly booed in that moment in that town hall. But that was John McCain. He was just not going to try. He was willing to do things like name Sarah Palin to be on the ticket with him to try to win the campaign. But he just wasn't going to truck in conspiracism, and he was just too noble a human being to make an alliance with that. And listen, it sounds high-minded and impossible, but that wasn't all that long ago. I mean, I think, look, if voters have to select, have to be attracted to candidates who just a tincture of nobility, and who are like, yeah, I want to win, and I'll do lots of things to win. I'll name Sarah Palin, but I'm not going to do anything to win. And without that, I don't know. Maybe conspiracism wins.
So your last book was on conspiracism. I know that you're at work on a new work also with Nancy Rosenblum on Ungoverning. Give us a little bit of a preview of that.
Just, as I said, we sort of followed the logic of the rigged election conspiracy to the prospect of an attack on election administration. We also, the other great, kind of conspiracy of the Trump era was the deep state conspiracy. And another amazing kind of comprehensive charge that the entire civil service was, machinating to defeat Trump, to humiliate Trump, to defeat the interests of his supporters. And so the very sort of bureaucracy that he commanded as president was actually scheming to oppose him. And this led to a much more comprehensive assault on the administrative state than I think was adequately recognized. There were some, like Michael Lewis, who kind of saw it and wrote about it, but partly because the administrative state is just, who loves bureaucracy? Just not there's nothing very sexy about it. But it does everything.
It takes somebody of the narrative skill of Michael Lewis to make it interesting and to get people engaged in it. And even then, I would bet that of all his many best-selling books, that one was probably one of the ones that sold least well.
Yeah, The Fifth Risk. I mean, he's an extraordinary writer. He has a great knack for it. But I think also he's just a citizen who uncommonly recognized what kind of threat was at work there. And that's what Nancy and I are writing about in this new book that we're working on right now called Ungoverning. And ungoverning is the word we use to describe this attack on the state itself, an attack on the capacity of the state, an attack on the legitimacy of the state. It's extraordinarily uncommon for political leaders to decide to make the state that they run less capable. It's not something we see a lot of. That's why the word ungoverning is kind of a new concept, I think. Although we do see it in other, it does show up in other cases of democratic erosion. I think you see it with Bolsonaro in Brazil, for example, or saw it in Venezuela. And so this is what we want to kind of chart this. We want to name it. We want to describe something about its force and its consequences. In the hope that that we can, whether we're liberal or conservative, resist it. And it's another case, right? When we were finishing the book on conspiracy, and we were sending the manuscript to the press, we said to each other, "Is this just going to disappear by the time the book comes out?" As you know, there's this big lag between when you finish the manuscript and when the book actually gets published. And this is another one. I mean, maybe ungoverning goes away. Maybe it appeared in the 2016 to 2020 window, and we're just never going to see it again. Nancy and I actually think that there are potent enough political rewards that can be accessed with an ungoverning strategy that now that it's been somewhat normalized, we think it will come back. And in particular, what ungoverning does is it allows for concentration of personal power in the president. And so there will be certain types of, never mind Trump, post-Trump presidents who are going to find an ungoverning strategy really attractive. I mean, there's this idea, like, there's a difference between, what the whole idea of governing is about is the power of an institution. And the presidency is an institution. It's an office. I could hold it, somebody else could hold it. It rotates through different people. It's not about the individual person. It's about the office. So the presidency could be imperial and powerful. It could be weaker, whatever. What ungoverning is about is concentrating the personal power of the individual president. It's not about building up the power of the office. And that kind of personal power, which is, it's not what modern government is about, though it is what arbitrary rule before the age of modern government was about. That's what ungoverning gets us to. And there's the power seekers are going to find that delicious. And so that's what we're trying to put our finger on, to name, to describe, to alert people to.
2024 is no longer that far away. And so the question of whether or not Donald Trump will run and whether he might win is on my mind and the minds of many people. I'm struck by the fact that Trump is not popular, that all of the polls suggest that most Americans dislike him, and that most Americans are pretty skeptical of large parts of the Republican Party. And yet it seems hard for Democrats to build that lasting governing majority that you talked about at the beginning of our conversation. Why is that? What are Democrats doing wrong?
I think that we are we're so indignant at the way the other side assaults and attacks the values that we care about most, that we don't really think we need to make the case for our own principles, our own policies, and we don't think we need to make the case in the way that you would need to people who don't already agree with you. And so the conversation that we are in, those of us who work in campaigns, who vote in primaries, who write checks, who are really attuned to politics all throughout the year, the conversation we're in is one with people who agree with us all the time, and that can just make it makes us really, really bad at remembering how to make the case for our own program to people who aren't already with us. Just yesterday, I was talking to somebody who's working my house, and a blue collar worker who was sanding my floor, and we were having a very fun chat, and he mentioned to me that he supports Trump, and this is that's the moment for me to discover something about what makes this person who works super, super hard at a job that most certainly doesn't carry health insurance want to support Donald Trump. And the more I can learn about why that person, who's in many ways, I just think has none of the qualities that Donald Trump himself has that would put you off to Donald Trump as a person, and is a very, decent, lovely person. What that person finds attractive is the secret to winning in 2024. So I would sort of just beg my friends who happen to be in my party to look for moments like that one that I discovered yesterday and learn.
And what did you learn in that conversation?
Again, I would just go back to the importance of the dignity of work. There are a lot of people who really work hard. They live by their wits, and they've come to identify the Democratic Party as the party of people who don't want to work. And that's so false. It's just a slander on the Democratic Party. But I mean, I think we need to speak the language of the dignity of work in order to convince people that's not who we are. We want to defend the dignity of work. We don't want to offend those who do work.
So if people are broadly convinced by your arguments, what do you think they can do other than perhaps donate to one of your future campaigns to help the United States survive the threat to its democracy. What can listeners to this podcast do, and what can some of your peers in democratic politics do to increase the chances of beating populists like Trump in the years to come?
Yeah, I mean, in as voters, I really think we have to not just ask which candidate agrees with me most perfectly, which candidate mirrors my own convictions and feelings and passions, but which candidate is going to be able to translate these things that I believe in to people who don't agree with us best. And that's just a different kind of question from the one we normally ask. Who do you like, Yascha, who's running? Well, I like so-and-so because, they're appealed to me, but that's not the lock we need to turn right now. In the last election, I mean, who thought Joe Biden would be the candidate in the week before the New Hampshire primary? But he proved pretty good at making the case to a really diverse electorate on a nationwide basis. So we need to ask that question. But I do think, in our just daily life, I really think right now in the country, we need to figure out how to have coffee with each other when we don't agree. And I don't think this is going to change the election in 2024. But I do think we need to build a daily life, a culture that grows out of daily life, where we remember how to enjoy each other, even though we disagree ferociously with each other. So I think, say, what can listeners do? What can we do? What can I do? I think we need to cultivate those occasions where we hang out and enjoy each other's company, even though we don't agree. And this goes back to kind of Bob Putnam's work on social capital. I mean, we're not bowling together and we're not in these sorts of places. We need to recreate these occasions and kind of practice, not for very long, but just a half hour or so, enjoying each other. And I don't know quite how that's going to work, but I do think that would do enormous things, not just for our ability to knit ourselves together as one common political community, but more importantly, I think for our ability to create winning coalitions.
Russ Muirhead, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, yeah, a real pleasure. Thanks, Yascha.